Ask most people where Turkish DNA comes from, and you'll get the same answer almost every time. Central Asia, the steppe. Nomadic horsemen riding out of the same vast grasslands that produced the Mongol Empire, sweeping into Anatolia and becoming the ancestors of modern Turkey, a story repeated in national narratives, tourist guidebooks, and casual conversation alike, treated as settled fact by people who never once thought to ask whether the genetics actually backed it up. Geneticists actually tested that assumption, sequenced the DNA, compared it against population after population across Central Asia, looking for a genetic match to back up the story everyone already believed, running the same rigorous comparisons that had already reshaped how researchers understood ancient migrations in Iran, in Iberia, and across half the ancient world. They found almost nothing, except for one single population, out of dozens tested, that actually lined up the way the legend claimed. And what the rest of the data revealed instead completely rewrites where modern Turkish ancestry actually comes from, tracing back to a much older and far more locally rooted story than the one usually told. Stick around, because by the end of this video you'll understand exactly what happened when a language swept across an entire region while the genetics underneath it mostly stayed exactly where they'd already been for thousands of years. If untangling a country's real genetic story is the kind of thing you want more of, hit subscribe right now, because that's exactly what this channel does every single week. Let's start with the history everyone already knows, because it's the part that makes the DNA results so surprising. To understand why the genetics turned out so different from the popular story, it helps to know exactly what was already sitting in Anatolia before the Seljuks ever arrived, because it was not an empty landscape waiting to be populated. Anatolia is home to some of the oldest continuous human settlements anywhere on Earth. Çatalhöyük, a Neolithic settlement in central Anatolia dating back roughly 9,000 years, is considered one of the largest and best preserved early farming communities ever excavated, a densely packed town of mud brick houses entered through rooftop openings, home to thousands of people at its peak, evidence of a population already deeply rooted in that exact landscape millennia before anyone had invented writing, let alone conquered an empire. Later, the Hittites built one of the major powers of the Bronze Age Near East directly on Anatolian soil, rivaling Egypt and Mesopotamia in influence for centuries, followed by Phrygians, Lydians, waves of Greek colonization along the coastlines stretching back nearly 3,000 years, Persian rule, Alexander's conquests, Roman administration, and over 1,000 years of continuous Byzantine Greek civilization, each layer adding its own genetic contribution to a population that had already been accumulating ancestry from across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East for thousands of years, by the time any Turkic-speaking group arrived at all. In 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert, Seljuk Turkic forces defeated the Byzantine army in eastern Anatolia, opening the region to waves of Turkic-speaking migration that would, over the following centuries, completely transform the political and linguistic landscape of what had been, for well over 1,000 years before that, a Greek-speaking, Christian, fundamentally Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, home to some of the oldest continuously inhabited cities and cultural traditions anywhere in the ancient world. Oghuz Turkic tribes, originating from Central Asia, moved into Anatolia in successive waves over the following 2 centuries, eventually establishing the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum and later, out of its fragmented successor states, the Ottoman Empire, one of the largest and longest-lasting empires in world history, eventually stretching from the gates of Vienna to the Persian Gulf, and controlling territory across 3 continents at its height. By the time the Ottoman Empire reached its height, Turkish had become the dominant language across the region, replacing Greek in everyday administration and eventually in daily life across most of Anatolia over the course of several centuries, and the popular story that followed was straightforward. Central Asian people had arrived, conquered, and settled, becoming the direct genetic ancestors of the millions of people who would go on to call themselves Turkish. An origin story simple enough to fit neatly onto a single page of a history textbook. That's the version taught for generations, repeated in national narratives, textbooks, and popular history alike, reinforced by everything from school curricula to national holidays commemorating the arrival of the Seljuks as the founding moment of the modern Turkish nation. Then researchers actually sequenced the DNA. Multiple large-scale genetic studies examining the ancestry of modern Anatolian Turkish populations, drawing on genome-wide comparisons across thousands of individuals and cross-referencing them against reference panels spanning dozens of Eurasian populations from Portugal to Mongolia, have consistently found something the old narrative doesn't fully explain. When compared against reference populations from across Eurasia, modern Turkish genetic ancestry clusters overwhelmingly with populations from the Balkans, the Caucasus, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the broader Near East, the exact populations who were already living in and around Anatolia for thousands of years before the Seljuks ever crossed into the region. The genetic signal connecting modern Turkish populations to Central Asia, the supposed homeland of the entire identity, turns out to be small. Not absent entirely, but far smaller than the scale of the historical and linguistic transformation would suggest, a finding replicated across multiple independent research teams working with different sample sets and different statistical methods, which is exactly the kind of consistency that gives geneticists confidence the result reflects something real rather than a quirk of any single study's dataset. Estimates vary study to study, but most place the detectable Central Asian genetic contribution to the modern Anatolian Turkish population somewhere in a relatively narrow band, often cited in the range of roughly 10% or less of total ancestry, layered on top of an overwhelmingly indigenous Anatolian genetic base that had already been established in the region since long before recorded history began there at all. A base built up over millennia by farmers, traders, and empires that had nothing to do with Central Asia whatsoever. Sit with that for a second. An entire language, an entire empire, an entire national identity, and the genetic contribution from the population credited with bringing all of it turns out to be a minority slice of the actual ancestry carried by the people who inherited that identity. Y chromosome data tracking direct paternal lineage adds even more detail to this picture. The dominant Y chromosome haplogroups found across the modern Turkish population are ones widely shared with populations across the Near East, the Caucasus, and the Eastern Mediterranean, haplogroups like J and G that trace deep roots in that broader region going back thousands of years before any Turkic migration. The haplogroups more strongly associated with Central Asian and Siberian populations, the ones you'd expect to dominate if a large-scale Central Asian population had genetically overwhelmed Anatolia, the way the popular narrative implies, show up only as a minority presence, consistent with the same modest contribution the broader genome-wide studies had already found, reinforcing the same conclusion from an entirely separate line of genetic evidence. Mitochondrial DNA tracing maternal ancestry tells an even more striking version of the same story. Because large-scale migrations dominated by soldiers, administrators, and male settlers tend to leave a lighter footprint on maternal lineages than on paternal ones, the mitochondrial DNA of the modern Turkish population leans even more heavily toward deep indigenous Anatolian and broader Near Eastern ancestry than the paternal data does. Whatever Oghuz Turkic migrants arrived in the 11th century and afterward, they appear to have arrived in numbers heavily skewed toward men, soldiers, and administrators, rather than entire families relocating together, who then married into and were gradually absorbed by the existing local population, generation after generation, exactly the demographic pattern researchers expect to find underneath a genuine elite dominance event. This is the same pattern researchers have documented in a handful of other cases around the world, a phenomenon called elite dominance, where a politically or militarily powerful group arrives, successfully spreads its language and institutions across an entire population without ever contributing more than a modest fraction of the actual genetic ancestry to the people who end up speaking that language for the next 1,000 years. It's rarer than most people assume. Most large-scale language shifts throughout history came bundled together with a genuine matching wave of genetic replacement, the two moving hand in hand as one population physically displaced or absorbed another in large enough numbers to reshape both language and DNA at once. It happened in Iran with the spread of Persian over the indigenous population of the ancient Iranian plateau, where the language of a relatively small group of steppe-descended migrants eventually became dominant, while the underlying population remained overwhelmingly rooted in a much older, indigenous, Zagros-descended ancestry. It shows up again here in Anatolia, with the spread of Turkish over a population whose genetic roots trace back to farmers, Hittites, Greeks, Byzantines, and dozens of other Near Eastern and Mediterranean populations who called that peninsula home for thousands of years before the word Turk meant anything in that part of the world at all. The Seljuks and later the Ottomans didn't genetically replace the population of Anatolia. They ruled it, married into it, and spread their language across it, administering a vast, diverse empire through institutions, taxation, and religious conversion rather than through mass population displacement, while the underlying population, generation after generation, remained overwhelmingly descended from the people who were already there, farming the same valleys and living in the same coastal cities their ancestors had occupied for thousands of years before any Seljuk banner was ever raised over Anatolia. Now here's where the story gets genuinely strange, because researchers didn't just find a small Central Asian genetic signal and stop looking. They wanted to know exactly where in Central Asia that smaller signal actually traced back to, testing it against population after population scattered across the region, from Kazakhstan to Uzbekistan to Mongolia to the Turkmen steppe, comparing shared genetic markers, allele frequencies, and broader population structure across dozens of reference groups spanning thousands of miles of the historical Silk Road corridor. Most of those comparisons came back weak. Genetic distance too large, shared markers too sparse to draw a confident connection, the kind of result that would normally be expected between populations separated by that much geography and that many centuries of independent history, migration, and intermarriage with entirely different neighboring groups along the way. Population after population tested, and population after population failed to show a clean, strong genetic link to the Central Asian component actually present in modern Turkish DNA. Except one. The Turkmen population, concentrated in modern Turkmenistan and neighboring parts of Central Asia, consistently showed up as the closest genetic match to the Central Asian ancestry component found in Turkish populations, out of every group tested, standing out clearly from the rest of the comparison set, rather than sitting somewhere in a vague middle ground. And when you dig into the history, that result stops looking like a coincidence and starts looking exactly what you'd expect. The Oghuz Turkic tribes, who eventually became the Seljuks and later the Ottomans, are the same broad historical and linguistic group that the modern Turkmen people themselves descend from, sharing a documented common origin recorded in medieval historical sources centuries before any geneticist ever thought to test the connection directly. Two populations separated by nearly 1,000 years and thousands of miles of divergent history, one settling permanently in Anatolia and blending into an existing Mediterranean population, the other remaining in Central Asia and continuing a more direct, less diluted line of descent from the same original Oghuz ancestors. The DNA didn't just fail to confirm the popular story, it quietly pointed to the one population that actually makes historical sense as the closest surviving genetic relative to the original migrants, while confirming that almost everyone else tested across Central Asia simply isn't closely related to modern Turkish ancestry at all, despite centuries of assumption that the entire Turkic-speaking world must share a tight genetic bond running the length of the whole Silk Road. There's a broader pattern buried in this discovery, and it applies well beyond Turkey specifically. Language and identity travel differently than genes do. A population can adopt a language, a religion, an entire cultural framework from a relatively small number of arriving migrants, and then pass that identity down for centuries, even as the underlying genetic ancestry of that population remains overwhelmingly rooted in whoever was already living there long before the migration ever happened. Modern nationalism, in Turkey and in plenty of other countries, has often leaned on a simplified singular origin story, one clean point of ancestral pride tracing back to one dramatic historical moment, a founding myth that's easier to teach, easier to commemorate, and easier to build a shared identity around than a messier, multi-layered genetic reality spanning 10,000 years and dozens of overlapping populations. The genetics almost never cooperate with that kind of simplicity. In Turkey, or almost anywhere else, researchers have gone looking closely enough to check. What the DNA actually shows is a population built from layer after layer of history. Deep Anatolian roots stretching back through the Byzantine and Hittite periods and beyond into some of the earliest farming communities anywhere in the ancient Near East, communities that had already been cultivating that same landscape for thousands of years before anyone had built a single pyramid or written a single word down anywhere on Earth. A substantial genetic contribution from populations across the Caucasus and the Balkans, reflecting thousands of years of movement, trade, and intermarriage across a region that has always sat at the crossroads of three continents, absorbing merchants, settlers, and refugees from every direction across the entire span of recorded history, and layered on top of all of that a real but comparatively modest genetic contribution from the Oghuz Turkic migrations that gave the region its language, its dominant religion, and eventually its name. Concentrated most closely of everything tested in the modern Turkmen population still living closer to the original Oghuz homeland today. None of this makes the Ottoman Empire or Turkish history or Turkish identity any less real or any less significant. The empire was genuinely one of the most powerful and influential in world history, reshaping politics, culture, and religion across three continents for over 600 years, leaving behind an architectural, linguistic, and cultural legacy still shaping the region today. What changes is the question of where the people themselves actually came from. Mostly from a population that had already been living in Anatolia and the surrounding region for thousands of years before the Seljuks ever crossed into it, absorbing a new language, a new empire, and a new identity, while remaining, underneath all of it, genetically closer to their Mediterranean and Near Eastern neighbors, the Greeks, the peoples of the Caucasus, the broader Levant, and then to the Central Asian homeland their national story so often points back to. There's something worth sitting with in that. A nation's deepest sense of where it came from often gets built around the most dramatic chapter of its history, the conquest, the empire, the moment everything visibly changed, the story with battles and sultans, and a clear beginning anyone can point to on a timeline. But the DNA tells a quieter story, running underneath all of that drama, one where most of the actual people, generation after generation, simply kept being who they'd already been, adopting new words, new rulers, and new gods, while their own genetic inheritance kept quietly tracing back to the same stretch of land their ancestors had occupied since long before anyone had a word for Turkey or the Seljuks or the Ottomans at all. This pattern isn't unique to Turkey, and it isn't a story about any one nation's history being somehow less legitimate than it believed. It's a pattern that keeps showing up again and again whenever researchers actually check the genetics behind a dramatic conquest narrative. Language, religion, and political identity are remarkably good at spreading fast, sometimes in a matter of generations. Genetics moves at a completely different pace, anchored to who is actually having children with whom, generation after generation, largely indifferent to which empire happens to be flying its flag overhead at any given moment in that population's much longer story. If untangling a nation's real genetic story past the empires, past the assumptions everyone repeats without checking, is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe to DNA Exposed, because next week we go looking for another population whose DNA tells a story nobody expected. Empires rise, languages spread, national myths get written and repeated for centuries. But the people underneath all of it have a way of quietly staying exactly who they always were. We'll see you in the next one.